My name is Evelyn Tiffany Castiglione. I'm a professor and assistant provost at Texas A&M University, and it's our great pleasure to be one of the sponsors of this outstanding conference. It's my pleasure also to introduce a special guest, George Abbey, who is going to address some remarks to you briefly. He is the Senior Fellow in Space Policy at the Baker Institute, and from 1996 to 2001, he served as director of the NASA Johnson Space Center. Before he was assigned as an Air Force captain to the Apollo program, he served some other roles in the Air Force in space, and he was named the director of flight operations in 1976, where he was responsible for operational planning and management of flight crew and flight control activities for all manned spaceflight missions. Then in 1983, he became director of Flight Crew Operations Directorate, and in 1990, he was selected as Deputy for Operations and Senior NASA Representative to the Synthesis Group, and he was charged with defining strategies for returning to the moon and landing on Mars. In 1991, he was appointed to the Senior Director of Civil Space Policy for the National Space Council in the Executive Office of the President. And he received numerous awards, including the NASA Exceptional Service Medal, the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal, and 3 NASA Distinguished Service Medals. He was a member of the operations team that received the Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States in 1970 for its role in the support of the Apollo 13 mission. So he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1954 and got the master's degree in electrical engineering from the U.S. Air Force Institute of Technology in 1959. Please welcome Mr. George Abbey.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very good for me to be here today. It's been a very interesting conference, and one that I've enjoyed all the presentations. This year is a very significant year, and it's the 50th anniversary of the first flight of the Apollo manned spacecraft. And it's also the 50th anniversary of the first flight of humans that went beyond Earth orbit. Apollo 7 was the first manned mission, and it flew in October of 1968. And we're very fortunate this afternoon to have a member of that crew here with us, Walt Cunningham, who flew on that mission. And that mission was very critical to the success of the later flights. The next mission, Apollo 8, was going to be flown 2 months later, and it was going to be in January of 1968. The plan was that it was going to be a lunar module mission with a command and service module, and it would fly in Earth orbit and would be the first test of the lunar module manned. And that was, I say, the plan in January 68. January 12, 68, that was our plan. That was 50 years ago. But in June of 1968, the lunar module was delivered to the Kennedy Space Center, and it had been late in its delivery, and it had significant problems. And Grumman, the contractor for the lunar module, said it really wouldn't be ready to fly until February of 1969. And that posed a major problem because Apollo 7 was pretty much on schedule, but with Apollo 8 and the lunar module in that situation, it really put in jeopardy the other missions and our landing on the moon before the end of the decade. In August of 1968, the individual I worked for, George Lowe, the Apollo spacecraft program manager, took a week-long, much-needed vacation. And when he returned, he had come up with a new plan. He had come up with an idea that if we were successful in Apollo 7, the next mission of the command and service module would be a flight to the moon in December, 2 months later. And it would be done without the lunar module. And that way we would be able to evaluate our lunar trajectories and also to evaluate our orbital procedures around the moon without having the complication of the lunar module with us. And he was able to sell that plan to the NASA leadership. They all accepted it. The most difficult individual he had to sell was the administrator of NASA, James Webb. But with most of the NASA leadership agreeing to do it, Mr. Webb reluctantly went along with it. But he decided that we really wouldn't announce it as a lunar mission, that it would be carried as an Earth orbital mission, at least until November, when we had an opportunity to evaluate the results from Apollo 7. And if it was determined 7 was a good mission and the spacecraft was in a position where we could take it to the moon, then we would announce that mission in November. So we announced it 40 days before the flight. And we flew, of course, the mission in December, and the world was able to see the crew go into orbit around the moon and see a close-up view of the lunar surface. Well, the crew read from the Bible, and it was a very emotional time, I think, and throughout the whole world. We were successful in both those flights. The next flight was a lunar module flight, and it was tested in Earth orbit. And then the next flight was a dress rehearsal, taking the lunar module and the command and service module back to the moon and overflying the Apollo 11 landing site, and then successfully landing on the moon in July of 1969. But as I say, the mission that was really critical to that was Apollo 7, because without it and without its success, none of that really would have happened. Since the 50 years that we flew that first Apollo spacecraft, there have been 2 presidents who have announced initiatives to return to the moon. George Herbert Walker Bush, on the 20th anniversary of the lunar landing in July of 1969, announced a new initiative to go back to the moon. Unfortunately, the funding didn't materialize, and the program didn't really go any further. And 15 years later, George W. Bush announced in January 2004 an initiative to go to the moon and go to Mars. And he said that additional money would be provided. But again, unfortunately, that additional money wasn't provided. And in the interest of trying to keep the program going with reduced funding, a number of NASA programs and research, worthwhile research and programs were terminated in order to divert money to the lunar mission. When George Bush's successor came into office, President Obama, he called for a committee to review the future of the human space flight and its programs. And that committee was chaired by Norm Augustine. And back in 2009, they determined that there was no plan that was available at that time that really could be supported with the predicted funding. And they said the Constellation program, the plan that George W. Bush had approved and moved forward with, would require $3.6 billion a year more each year in order to be successful, and it couldn't really be successful on the schedule that was being advertised. So President Obama canceled that program and started talking about going to Mars. And in 2015, the administrator of NASA came out with a program saying they were going to go to Mars in 2030. But there was no funding presented and no real detailed schedule. And so last July, 2017, the head of human spaceflight in NASA admitted that they didn't really have the money to do such a program. And now last month, the President of the United States announced again that I'm going to direct NASA to go to the moon and on to Mars. And of course, the critical element of all that is, like it always is, it's the funds. Walt Cunningham, who's here today, used to quote Gus Grissom, no bucks Rogers, and that's probably as valid as the times that Walt quoted it as it was when Gus said it. But that is really the critical factor, getting the funds. In 2014, the National Academies commissioned a study that was the pathways to exploration, a review of the future of human spaceflight exploration, and it was chaired by the president of Purdue University, Mitch Daniels. And they came up with, I think, a number of significant recommendations. Recommendations that said, really, if you were going to go do an exploration program, it had to be supported by sustained budgets that would carry through over decades and various administration changes. In the 60s, we were fortunate because we did have funding that carried through the whole 60s and through the completion of the program and through the administrative changes. But they made that point a strong point in their study. They also said you'd have to make investments in the research if you were going to go to Mars. And there were a lot of areas of research that really needed to be supported. And they also said that you needed to really do it with other countries, with international cooperation, and have those countries contribute significant amounts of money to fund that. And then in turn, they would be giving substantive roles. But they would also do it differently than we have done programs to date. And you would really come up with some partnerships with the commercial industry as well, and use the partnerships and the capabilities that exist out there with companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX. And I think all those recommendations they came up with are valid and are all doable and should be implemented. And as we look to what's the next step with the President's directive, I think hopefully those kind of actions will be implemented. But over and above that, I think there is a critical step that needs to be taken, and I think the Academy here can really play a part in it. Because I think we were fortunate back in the 60s, within the aerospace industry, we had a really strong technical capability. That doesn't exist today like it did then. But I think it does exist within the university community. And I think if you look at the state of Texas and its universities, for both really medicine, engineering, and science, that they can all make a significant contribution to making sure this initiative happens. Because I don't think we're going to make it really happen without that kind of support coming from the university community. I think it's critical to the future. And I would hope that the Academy could play a strong role in ensuring that would happen, and that our universities here in Texas would play a major role in that. So as I think we look to the future, hopefully that will happen, and this time we'll have a president that follows through with the right initiative, because I think human spaceflight exploration is critical to the future of the country. I think the other parts of the world, Russia, China, Japan, all the other spacefaring nations, Europe and Canada, they all want to go back to the moon. And I think doing it under the United States leadership is important. And I think as Ms. Daniels and his committee said, we should consider bringing China into that as well as all of these spacefaring nations. So I'm hopeful as we look to the future that we're going to have a program going back to the moon and Mars. And I hope that the young people of today in our university community can play an important role in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abbey. Thank you, Mr. Abbey, for those important and sobering remarks about the future of manned spaceflight, human spaceflight, and the involvement of the United States.